I live just outside of Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, and only 10 minutes away from Canton, Mississippi, where my grandmother and great-grandmother grew up. When I read about the wars of the Old Testament that happened thousands of years ago, it's sobering to realize that the wounds of the Civil War are comparatively recent, and that this town was a smoldering ash heap following the trauma of slavery not so very long ago. On May 14th, 1863, General Sherman began the bombardment of the city of Jackson. I recall the terror-stricken flight of thousands of women and children as we streamed along the roads that hot day with everything we could carry. We did not know whether we would ever come back to the house or whether the house would escape the fire. We camped in tents on the Pearl River for several weeks. Thomas Frank Gaylor, 6-year-old child, the future Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee. Jackson was burned 3 times, earning the nickname Chimneyville, since all that was left standing of the desolated city were the homeless, charred brick chimneys that smoked alone across the scorched landscape. Since I was a kid growing up in small-town Mississippi, I've loved the gutsy wail of a passionate blues song, and my own exploration of music began in folk and blues. These songs carry the throbbing pulse of shared labor and oppression, and sing with the cutting cry of deep woundedness. I can't help but think of the psalmist's cry in Psalm 129:3. The plowers plowed upon my back, they made long their furrows. Recently, I was leading worship with some friends at a youth retreat, and my friend Jason Cook, he was preaching. He's a really powerful athlete. He played pro football for a time before he left that. He felt the call to ministry, and it is really beautiful to hear. He has this resonant, booming African American voice, and to hear that voice proclaiming the gospel of grace is really beautiful and encouraging. The pre-chorus for this song came from a sermon that he preached at that youth event, where he was describing grace as just wave after wave after wave of grace upon grace upon grace on a shoreline, like waves on a shoreline.
During the civil rights period, there was a season where people were not welcomed because of the color of their skin. That there were groups of students from Tougaloo College, other pastors from around the country who came to stand for civil rights and participate in church kneel-ins. And Galloway was one of the places where people were turned away. So it was definitely a season in the life of the church where, it seemed like there was not much grace being extended. But over time, as people continued to visit, as God continued to work in people's hearts, over time those policies were changed and the doors were opened where all are welcome.
Jim Clarksdale is a made-up name for a real person that my dad worked with once. In the first 15 years of my dad's job, he was primarily out in the field helping rural farmers. One such farmer, an older black gentleman who farmed the land that he owned outright, told my dad that he felt sorry for another farmer, a white man, who had gotten himself into a great deal of debt. Since he'd gotten a little too big for his britches and dealt underhandedly, the white farmer was losing his land. 2 things struck me. One is that my dad had this really candid friendship with this older black farmer. And 2, the black farmer's just graceful compassion for this failing white farmer. And I realized that there is a lot of lingering pain here, but there's not only that. There's more than just smoldering grief and resentment. There's also this persistent lapping of wave after wave of grace upon grace upon grace. And all of that is flowing from Jesus' heart. And Jesus was a man whose back was plowed and his body was pierced, but he chose to forgive those who tortured him. That's good news. The book of Psalms closes with a series of songs calling for full throttle celebration of God's merciful provision. And Psalm 148, in Eugene Peterson's The Message, says, "Praise God, earth's kings and all races, leaders and important people, robust men and women in their prime, and yes, graybeards and little children." First of all, I just love the phrase graybeards, and I wanted to kind of use graybeards in a song somewhere. But the image that came into my mind was of old men and old women just lifting up babies and kind of tossing them in the air in this big community celebration dance. The babies are laughing and everyone's full of joy because they're responding to the reality of Jesus' grace upon grace, the wave after wave of his grace. And that's the only thing that really makes true reconciliation and compassion possible. The second verse is Peter's betrayal of Jesus around the fire after Jesus is taken prisoner. I love the Gospel of John, and chapter 20 ends with these words: "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." I've often wondered if John intentionally closed his book up and with chapter 20 and then intentionally didn't answer the question of but what about Peter? It's almost like that scene in the Princess Bride where Peter Falk is reading the book to his grandson, and he keeps closing it at all these really interesting times so that he'll close it and he'll be like, you don't want to hear any more of this story. And the grandson will say, but what about the princess? What happens? And it's almost like John does that, and everybody's saying, well, wait a minute, but what about Peter? Peter betrayed Jesus. Does he get left out? And then John says, I'm glad you asked. Let me add an extra chapter. And in that extra chapter, Peter has given up being a fisher of men, and he's become a fisher of fish again. And then Jesus, the master, appears to cook this beachside breakfast for the boys. And Peter dives into the water, and he erupts dripping on the shore where Jesus confronts him 3 times, echoing the betrayal. And like the water lapping on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, come the 3 waves of invitation for Peter to rejoin Jesus and feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Wave after wave after wave, grace upon grace upon grace.